Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for being here. We'll be joined shortly by Ranking Member Bass and other members of the subcommittee, but we do have votes scheduled for 3:15. There will be a brief break for that. Then we'll come back and conclude the testimonies from our distinguished witnesses. For most of the 37 years that I've been in Congress, the House and Senate have been heavily involved in U.S. policy towards Sudan. For example, I've chaired 12 congressional hearings, including 2 markups on Sudan since 1996. My first hearing focused on chattel slavery in Sudan, and we actually had witnesses who had been slaves there, and many others, NGOs, who spoke of this egregious practice, followed by genocide hearings in the Darfur region, the persistent bombing of people in the Nuba Mountains, the Khartoum government's failure to abide by the 2011 agreement that created an independent South Sudan, and of course myriad human rights violations and the government's historic relationship with terrorist groups. The Sudan government has long sought sanctions relief, and Congress and successive administrations have considered such relief as an incentive for Khartoum to reach and abide by various peace agreements. When I, joined by Greg Simpkins, our chief of staff, personally met with President Bashir in Khartoum in August of 2005, I spoke about Darfur refugees and visited 2 of the refugee camps, Mukjar and Kama camp, and spoke almost exclusively during the hour-and-a-half-plus meeting about ending the violence. President Bashir, on the other hand, focused almost exclusively on sanctions relief. The Obama administration, in its last days in office in January, purported to see justification in ending a sanctions regime built over decades. In its announcement on the easing of sanctions, the Obama administration declared positive actions by the Sudanese government in 5 key areas. 1, pardon me, rebuilding counterterrorism cooperation. 2, countering the threat of the Lord's Resistance Army. 3, ending negative involvement in South Sudan's conflict. One of our witnesses will testify later. Negative involvement was never really defined. 4, sustaining a unilateral cessation of hostilities in Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile provinces. And 5, improving humanitarian access throughout Sudan. Missing in this list of positive developments is improvements in the overall human rights situation in Sudan, including and especially sex and labor trafficking. And I would remind our friends who are here at this hearing and my colleagues, Sudan is a Tier 3 country on the State Department's list, so it is an egregious violator, and the narrative in the report is an indictment, frankly, on both sex and labor trafficking. On religious freedom, Sudan continues to get a failing grade as well from the State Department, and has been designated, again, a country of particular concern, or CBC, which subjects it to other sanctions. It is well within the government's ability to meet the standards in the 5 areas mentioned, and I would hope other areas as well, if it truly has the will to do so. However, the government of Sudan has never been known for its respect of the rights of those not considered Arab, such as Darfur residents who were persecuted despite being largely Muslim, or Sudanese who were not Muslim at all. There was the case in 2014 of Miriam Ibrahim, a Christian woman sentenced to death by the Sudanese court for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. The court also ordered Ibrahim, who married a Christian man in 2011 and was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested and imprisoned, to receive 100 lashes for adultery because her marriage was considered void under Sharia law. The couple had a child, a 20-month-old boy, who was also in detention with her. Imagine that, a 20-month-old boy in detention next to her, behind bars. I joined with a group of House and Senate members, including our subcommittee's Vice Chairman, Congressman Meadows, in working with elements of the Sudanese government in an eventually successful effort to vacate the sentence and allow Ms. Ibrahim and her family to come to the United States. That effort demonstrated and perhaps highlighted that there are some elements of an internally divided Sudanese government with whom we can work with towards a better future for Sudan's people, but it also confirmed that other elements are viciously opposed to religious freedom and other fundamental human rights. The Obama administration's justification of its decision on sanctions relief was done in the absence of any congressional consultation and presented as a fait accompli. It freed more than $30 million in unfrozen Sudanese assets, allows commercial transactions in all sectors, and signaled a new policy of more positively reviewing licenses to do business in Sudan. Commercial transactions prohibited as a result of the government of Sudan's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism and Darfur-specific targeted actions are still in place. The entire sanctions easing process will be fully effective 6 months from the date of announcement on January 13th, 6 months from January 13th. Today's hearing is intended to begin asking the hard questions concerning sanctions relief in order to facilitate improved relations between the U.S. and Sudan, if that will benefit the people of Sudan. Nevertheless, it's incumbent upon the U.S. government to honestly consider the conditions under which sanctions easing is justified. As stated earlier, the government of Sudan is fully capable of meeting the requirements outlined in the January executive order, but we must be sure of the extent to which that government is abiding by them and urge them to do more where necessary. Various reports indicate that attacks on civilians, including sexual-based violence, continues by government and allied forces. Even though human rights improvement is not one of the requirements in the executive order by the former president, we must not, as a government, ignore this aspect. Successful administrations and Congresses have worked hard to ensure that human rights concerns in Sudan are addressed. And I would note parenthetically, in this room, back in the year 2000, I presided as chairman of this committee over the markup of the Sudanese Peace Act. This has been a totally comprehensive and bipartisan effort over the years. And again, human rights is essential if we are to truly help the people of Sudan. Now is not the time to abandon decades of work, as I said, by men and women of goodwill in our government and many American citizens who have supported our efforts. We must also not forsake the welfare of the people of Sudan, for whom our efforts all this time have been made. If the government of Sudan is indeed willing to work with us to fulfill the aspects mentioned in the executive order and improve the state of human rights in Sudan, then for the sake of the Sudanese people, our government should make the effort to work with them. But it will do the government of Sudan and its people no good if we turn a blind eye to ongoing problems and fail to press for genuine improvements that are sustainable and that can be clearly demonstrated. As we await the appointment of the Trump administration officials tasked with making the ultimate decisions on these matters, the clock is ticking. We have assembled a panel of private sector witnesses who can give us an expert look, a picture of the status of adherence to the requirements outlined in the executive order and human rights in Sudan. We do not have a witness that is involved in humanitarian activities. We asked a few because of their concern, and it's a justified concern. Had they spoken out and done so with the candor that they would do, that could limit their ability to do business and to provide humanitarian relief inside of Sudan. This hearing is only the beginning of Congress's investigation into the matter. By July 12th, when the sanctions easing regime fully comes to fruition or into effect, we hope to know whether there is sufficient justification to approve this action or whether more work needs to be done. So this is a timely hearing, I believe. Again, we have a panel of truly remarkable witnesses who are extremely knowledgeable, and for that, I am very grateful for you being here today. And I'd like to yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Bass. Okay, yield to Mr. Garrett.
Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, just wanted to take this opportunity to articulate sort of my concurrence with your assessment of the situation, but also to note the progress that's been made on a case that semi-parallels that of Miriam Ibrahim, and that being the case of Czech pastor Petr Yashik, as well as two Sudanese counterparts, Hassan Abdul Rahim and Abdul Manam Abdul Mawala, who are currently held in the Republic of the Sudan. I will say that my experience working directly with Mawia Khalid, the ambassador of the Republic to the United States, has been extremely fruitful, and that the Sudanese representation here in Washington has been very forthcoming and cooperative as it relates to our concerns in this instance, and we look forward to a positive outcome in those cases. That notwithstanding, obviously there are any number of steps to be taken moving forward, but I do believe and I want to articulate that establishing good faith and positive working relationships will actually help facilitate progress as Sudan works to move itself back into the mainstream of nations. And with that, I'd yield back my time, and thank you.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Suarez.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just waiting to listen to the witnesses. Thank you.
Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to thank you for conducting this important hearing with votes coming sometime within the next 20 minutes. I'll yield my time for the witnesses.
Thank you very much, Ms. Donovan. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the witness table. Beginning first, our witness up will be Ambassador Princeton Lyman. Is a senior advisor to the President of the United States Institute of Peace. He served as U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from 2011 to 2013. As Special Envoy, he led U.S. policy in helping in the implementation of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. His career in government, including assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and South Africa, and Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. He began his government career with USAID and served as its director in Ethiopia. He has testified several times before this committee, and we always are so glad to welcome him back and to welcome his insights and his wisdom. We'll then hear from Mr. Brad Brooks Rubin, who serves as the policy director for the Century and is policy advisor to the Enough Project. In this capacity, he helps to lead the efforts of the Century to disrupt the corrupt networks that fund and profit from genocide or other mass atrocities in Africa. From 2009 to 2013, Mr. Brooks Rubin served in the Special Advisor for Conflict Diamonds in the United States Department of State. While there, he also contributed to the U.S. efforts related to conflict minerals in eastern Congo, particularly in the area of corporate due diligence. Prior to joining the department, he served as attorney advisor in the Treasury Department's Office of the Chief Counsel on Foreign Assets Control. Then we'll hear from Mr. David DeToni, who is the Director of the Operations for the Sudan Relief Fund and the Managing Director of TSA, a German-based organization created to assist the lives of the people of Africa, particularly the people of Sudan and South Sudan. Previously, he was Director of Operations and Outreach at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and a Senior Legislative Assistant to Representative Frank Wolf. He assisted Mr. Wolf, Chairman Wolf, in foreign policy, national security, and global human rights initiatives, and was co-staff director of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. And then we'll hear from Mr. Mohammed Abu Bakr, the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project. He's a human rights activist, more than a decade of experience in the nonprofit sector. He has founded and served as director for multiple NGOs focused on humanitarian relief, human rights, youth empowerment, and peace programs across the Middle East and Africa. He has been hosted by many universities to address students on a variety of topics. In 2016, he launched the African Middle Eastern Leadership Project, or ML, the Arabic word for hope, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization that seeks to empower young leaders from the Middle East and Africa to build pluralistic societies. Ambassador Lyman, please proceed.
There we go. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Karen Bass, other members of the committee. This committee has, over the years, been extraordinarily attentive to the issues of Sudan and South Sudan. For those of us who work on it, we're very grateful, and I know you've had a major impact on the thinking and the policies in this area. Mr.